Alright, let's talk about one of the greatest rivalries in aviation history, a heavyweight championship fight held miles above the Korean peninsula. In one corner, the Soviet-built Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15. In the other, the North American F-86 Sabre. This wasn't just about two jets. It was a clash of ideologies, technologies, and some of the bravest pilots to ever grace the skies. So, which one was truly the best? Let's dive into the legendary duel over MiG Alley. Hi everyone and welcome back to the Jaxom Talks channel. So today we're diving into one of the most fascinating aerial matchups of the Cold War. If you've clicked on this video, you probably already know the basics. F-86 Sabre versus MiG-15, Korean War with jet fighters going at it over something called the MiG Alley. But stick with me, because what you think you know about those kill ratios, well yeah, that's probably wrong and missing some key insight. For decades, the official story was a clean 10-1 victory for the American Sabres. 10 MiGs down for every Sabre lost. Sounds impressive, right? Sounds like America engineering and pilot skill just crushed the competition. But here's where it gets interesting, and it's why I love military history. The truth is way more complicated, way more fascinating. It makes both sides look more impressive than the propaganda ever did. So in today's video, we're going to break down the four jets that mattered in the Korean War skies. The F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, and I'll also touch on the F-80 Shooting Star and the poor old British Gloucester Meteor. We'll look at design philosophy, range, firepower, and those controversial kill ratios. By the end, you'll have a better idea which jet actually deserved to be called the king of the Korean War skies. But first, and here is a big ask that will help this channel grow. Smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe. We will be covering everything from World War II warfare through to the Cold War conflicts. Don't forget to activate the ring notification bell, because you don't want to miss what's coming up next. Let's start with the American bird. The North American F-86 Sabre was basically what happens when you take captured German swept-wing research from World War II and combine it with good old American industrial might. And yes, they literally grabbed the aerodynamic data from Nazi engineers after the war, as everyone did, including the Soviets. No shame in that game. The Sabre's design philosophy was all about being a stable gun platform. North American aviation looked at dogfighting and said, we need a plane that's rock solid when you're pulling Gs and trying to line up a shot. The result was that beautiful 35-degree swept wing, a design that could dive faster than just about anything else in the sky, and critically, and this is huge, it had superior aerodynamic stability at high speeds. The F-86A that first showed up in Korea in December 1950 was powered by a General Electric J-47 turbojet, pumping out about 5,200 pounds of thrust. Not the most powerful engine in the world, but reliable. It had 650 caliber machine guns in the nose. Yes, they were still using machine guns. More on that controversy later. The top speed was about 685 miles per hour. Service ceiling topped out at 49,000 feet. Combat range was roughly 1,200 miles, though in practice over Korea, you were looking at maybe 500 miles of useful combat radius. Enter the MiG-15, the Soviet surprise package. Now let's talk about the MiG-15, and this is where the story gets really interesting. When this aircraft showed up over Korea in November 1950, American pilots basically had a collective oh crap moment, because the MiG-15 was, on paper, superior to anything the West had flying at the time. The design philosophy adopted by the Soviets was completely different. Mikoyan and Gurevich were told, design a bomber interceptor, make it climb fast, fly high, and hit hard. They weren't thinking about sustained dogfights, they were thinking about racing up to altitude, shredding a B-29 bomber formation with heavy cannons, and getting out, and boy, did they deliver. Think the Me-262 but more reliable. Here's the funny part about the MiG-15's engine. It was based on the Rolls-Royce Nene power plant that the UK, and I kid you not, sold to the Soviets in 1947. The British were looking for export cash and hoping to improve relations. The Soviets took that engine, called it the Climber VK-1, and suddenly had a power plant putting out comparable thrust to American engines. Sometimes history is stranger than fiction. The MiG-15's specs were genuinely scary. It had a service ceiling of about 50,000 feet, that's higher than the Sabre. Its rate of climb was better. The turning radius was tighter than the Sabre, and the real kicker, it could reach Mach 0.92, though it got real squirrely that fast. The Sabre could only safely hit about Mach 0.9, but crucially, it could dive faster and was way more aerodynamically stable all the way through. Now let's talk about the also-rans, the F-80, F-84 and Gloucester Meteor. The F-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderjet were America's first-generation straight-wing jets. They were fine aircraft for their time, but when the MiG-15 showed up with swept wings, they were immediately outclassed. Lieutenant Russell J. Brown, flying an F-80, actually scored the first jet versus jet kill in history when he downed a MiG-15 in November 1950. But after that early victory, the writing was on the wall. These straight-wing birds got relegated to ground attack duty, where they did excellent work, but for air superiority. That was now a swept-wing game. And the poor Gloucester Meteor, Britain's first jet fighter, flown by the Royal Australian Air Force in Korea. It was a brave aircraft with a proud history, but asking a straight-wing, twin-engine Meteor to tangle with a swept-wing MiG-15 at high altitude was like bringing a musket to a gunfight. The Aussies quickly figured out that staying low and focusing on ground attack was the way to stay alive. They were outmatched and they knew it. Here's where things get spicy. Let's talk guns, because this was a massive point of contention. The F-86 Sabre rolled into Korea with 650 caliber M3 Browning machine guns. These were basically slightly upgraded versions of the same guns used on P-51 Mustangs in World War II. Rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute per gun, total of about 1,800 rounds of ammunition. And yes, American pilots were definitely thinking, wait, we're fighting modern jets with World War II machine guns. The US Air Force's logic was this: machine guns have a much higher rate of fire than cannons of the time, which means more chances to hit a fast-moving target, and against the lightly armored fighters of the Second World War, the 50 caliber was devastating, but jet fighters? They're faster, more robust, and frankly, harder to kill. Stories from Korea tell of MiG-15s returning to base looking like Swiss cheese, riddled with 50 caliber holes, but still flying. Meanwhile, a few cannon shells from a MiG could turn an F-86 into confetti. The MiG-15 carried one 37mm N37 cannon and two 23mm NIS-23 cannons. These fired explosive shells. Think about that, explosive shells versus solid bullets. One solid hit from that 37mm cannon could rip a wing off, and the 23mm cannons weren't much friendlier. The downside? The MiG's cannons had a much lower rate of fire and limited in ammunition. The 37mm only carried 40 rounds. The 23mm cannons had 80 rounds each, so MiG pilots had to make every shot count. Miss and you might not get another chance. The US eventually wised up. They tested the F-86F with four 20mm cannons under Project Gunval, and guess what? It worked way better than they hoped, but by then the war was almost over. The lesson was learned though, and every US fighter after Korea went to cannon armament. The time of the 50 caliber fighter was dead. Edge in firepower has to go to the MiG-15, no contest, but as we'll see, having bigger guns doesn't automatically win the fight. Alright, so on paper, the MiG-15 looks pretty dominant. Better ceiling, better climb rate, better turn radius, heavier firepower. So why didn't the MiG-15 just sweep the Sabre out of the Korean skies? Because dogfighting isn't a stat sheet comparison, it's chess at 600 miles per hour. The tactics were fascinating. MiG pilots used their superior climb rate and altitude advantage. They'd perform a yo-yo, diving down on the Sabres, firing a pass, and then using their energy to climb back up into the sun, out of reach. They were told to avoid prolonged turning fights at lower altitudes, where the Sabre had an advantage. The Sabre pilots, on the other hand, knew their strengths. They were masters of teamwork, flying in a formation called the Fluid Four, where two pairs of jets would cover each other. If a Sabre got a MiG on its tail, its wingman was right there to clear it. The F-86 had one massive advantage. It was a rock-solid gun platform. When you're pulling Gs in high-speed turns, your wings are flexing, your controls are getting heavy, and you're trying to keep a gun sight on a target the size of a telephone booth that's moving at 600 miles per hour. The Sabre was stable. It tracked smoothly. You could actually aim the damn thing. The MiG-15, by contrast, got twitchy at high speeds. It started buffeting and would pitch up uncontrollably. Chuck Yeager, yes, that Chuck Yeager tested a captured MiG-15 and nearly died when he lost control in a high-speed dive. He made it down to 3,000 feet before he got it back under control. That's a change your underwear moment right there. Worse, the MiG-15 had a nasty tendency to spin if it stalled, and unlike most planes that give you warning signs before a stall, the MiG would just bite you and put you into a spin with very little warning. Records show at least 56 instances of UN pilots watching MiG-15s enter unrecoverable spins in combat, with 25 crashes and 10 ejections. That's not getting shot down, that's your own aircraft trying to kill you. The later F-86C and F model came equipped with the A1CM radar ranging gun sight. This really was space-age stuff for 1951. The radar would automatically calculate the target's range and compute the proper lead for your guns. Meanwhile, MiG pilots were using basic optical gun sights. It's like bringing a calculator to a math test while everyone else has an abacus. The F-86C introduced an all-flying tail, meaning the entire horizontal stabilizer moved. not just a little elevator tab at the back. This gave the Sabre much better control authority at high speeds. It could maneuver effectively at speeds where the MiG was starting to get squirrely. When in a high-speed scissors maneuver or a diving attack, this was huge. Here's something that doesn't show up in the spec sheets. The Americans and UN forces couldn't pursue the MiGs across the Chinese border. MiG Alley was in northwestern Korea, right up against the Yalu River. MiG pilots could retreat across the border where they were safe from pursuit. Sabres, meanwhile, had to fight deep in enemy territory. The MiGs also had ground-controlled interception Soviet radar stations that would vector them onto American formations. The Sabres often flew without this kind of support. The MiG pilots got to choose when to fight. That's not a small advantage. So yes, the MiG-15 had better pure performance numbers, but combat effectiveness. Now that's a different conversation, and it brings us to the most controversial part of this whole story. So here's where military history gets messy. For decades, the US Air Force claimed a 10-to-1 kill ratio. Some sources even said 14-to-1. The story was simple. American Sabres shot down 792 MiGs while losing only 78 Sabres. American technology and training crushed Soviet aircraft. But, and it's a big but, there's just one tiny problem with that narrative. It's propaganda. Let me be clear. I'm not saying American pilots weren't good. They were excellent. But those numbers, they don't hold up to scrutiny. Here's what we know now, thanks to Soviet records that became available after the Cold War and better historical research. Modern research suggests about 224 Sabres were lost during the war, with roughly 100 of those to air combat. On the other side, probably around 566 MiG-15s were destroyed by Sabres. That's not 10-to-1. That's more like 5.6-to-1. Still impressive. But not the crushing dominance the propaganda suggested. But wait, it gets more interesting. Those numbers include all MiG-15s, Soviet-piloted, Chinese-piloted, and North Korean-piloted. When you start breaking it down by who was flying, the picture changes dramatically. In 1951, the early phase of the jet war, Soviet pilots called the American Sabres the hard way. These pilots were World War II veterans, guys who'd survived the Eastern Front against the Luftwaffe. Names like Nikolai Satyajin, who claimed 21 kills, and Yevgeny Pepeleyev, who claimed 19. These guys knew what they were doing. Against these Soviet aces, the kill ratio for Sabres dropped to about 1.4 MiGs to 1 Sabre. That's basically a stalemate. Both sides were evenly matched when the pilots were similarly experienced. American pilots called this period the year of the honcho, honcho being Japanese for boss. They knew they were facing pros. In fact, the MiGs were so effective during this period that they forced the B-29 superfortresses to abandon daylight bombing missions. The B-29, which had dominated Japanese skies in World War II, was now getting shredded by MiG-15s. That's not supposed to happen if you're dominating 10-to-1. Then, in late 1951, something changed. The Soviet Union started rotating out their experienced pilots and replacing them with rookies. Why? Probably because they didn't want their top aces getting killed or captured. Remember, officially, the Soviet Union wasn't even in the war. Soviet pilots wore North Korean uniforms and tried to speak Korean on the radio. Getting one captured would be a diplomatic nightmare. So 1952 and 1953 saw inexperienced Soviet pilots, plus Chinese and North Korean pilots who were still learning to fly jets, going up against American pilots who now had a year or more of jet combat experience. That's when the kill ratios got lopsided. Against Chinese and North Korean pilots, the F-86 achieved a ratio somewhere around 12-to-1. That's a slaughter. Here's what the Americans got right. Pilot training. Many US Sabre pilots were World War II veterans. Guys like Gabi Gabreski, who had 28 kills in P-47 Thunderbolts over Europe and added 6 more in Sabres over Korea, or John Bolt, the only Marine to become an ace in both World War II and Korea. The Americans also had better training infrastructure. Pilots trained at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, where the training was so intense that they literally said, if you see the flag at full staff, take a picture, because it meant nobody had died in training that day. Dark humor, but it speaks to how seriously they took pilot preparation. The US also developed better tactics. They learned to use the Sabre's advantages, the stability, the diving speed, the radar gun sight, and avoid the MiG's strengths. Don't try to outclimb or outturn a MiG. Instead, fight in the vertical, use boom and zoom tactics, keep your speed up, and use your better controls at high speed. So what's the real kill ratio? Somewhere between 1.3 MiGs to 1 Sabre and 6-to-1. Depending on who's flying, the aggregate number is probably around 5-to-1, but that masks a much more complex reality. When pilots of equal skill met, the aircraft were fairly evenly matched. When experience levels diverged, training and tactics made all the difference. Let's talk about something less sexy but critically important. How far could these things fly? The F-86A had a combat radius of about 1,200 miles with external drop tanks. In practice, fighting over northwestern Korea from bases in the south, that meant maybe 20-30 minutes of combat time over MiG Alley before you had to head home. That's not a lot. Drop your tanks in a dogfight, and you're watching your fuel gauge like a hawk. The MiG-15 actually had worse range as it was designed as a point defense interceptor, not a long-range fighter. But here's the thing. MiG bases were right across the Chinese border. They didn't need long legs. They could scramble, fight for 45 minutes, and be back on the ground with fuel to spare. This created an operational disadvantage for the Sabres. You're flying into enemy territory, burning fuel just to get to the fight, knowing you have limited time before you have to leave, and knowing that the enemy can break off and retreat across a border you can't cross. Meanwhile, the MiG pilots are fighting near their bases with fuel reserves and nearby airfields. The Americans tried to compensate with in-flight refueling technology, which was brand new. They also established closer forward bases and improved their logistics. But fundamentally, they were always going to be at a range disadvantage. It's one reason why achieving any kind of positive kill ratio was impressive. Okay, moment of truth. You clicked on this video for an answer. Which jet fighter was the best in the Korean War? The MiG-15 was the better aircraft on paper. Better climb rate, better ceiling, better turn radius, heavier armament. If you're comparing spec sheets in a vacuum, the MiG wins. But wars aren't fought on spec sheets. They're fought by people, with training, tactics, and doctrine. And when you factor all that in, the answer is, the F-86 Sabre was the more effective combat aircraft. First, the Sabre was easier to fly well. The MiG-15's better performance came with handling quirks that could kill you. The tendency to spin, the control problems at high speed, these weren't just minor issues. They were design flaws that cost lives. The Sabre was forgiving. You could focus on fighting the enemy instead of fighting your own aircraft. The Sabre was also a better gun platform. In a turning dogfight at 500 to 600 miles per hour, being able to keep your gun sight on target is everything. The MiG's heavier armament didn't matter if you couldn't hit a barn door. The Sabre's stability and radar gun sight gave pilots a significant edge in delivering rounds on target. The Sabre was also designed for the fight it got into. The MiG was designed to zoom climb and shred bomber formations. That's not what the jet-v-jet combat over Korea ended up being. It was turning dogfights, scissor maneuvers, and high-speed vertical fights. The Sabre's design philosophy being a stable gun platform, controllable and reliable, was better suited to that environment. But, and this is really important, I'm not going to pretend the MiG-15 was a bad aircraft. It wasn't. It was an excellent design that achieved exactly what it was meant to do. When flown by experienced pilots who understood its strengths and limitations, it was absolutely deadly. The problem was that by 1952, most MiG pilots weren't experienced, and they were facing Sabre drivers who were. If I had to rank the Korean War jets, here's my list. 1. F-86 Sabre, best overall combat effectiveness. 2. MiG-15 best performance, but quirky handling. 3. F-84 Thunder jet solid ground attack, outclassed in air combat. At 4. The F-80 Shooting Star, America's first-generation jet, obsolete by 1951. And finally at 5. The Gloucester Meteor, the old but brave. Straight wings against swept wings was never going to end well. So there you have it, my view about Korean War jets, and it's not just propaganda. The F-86 Sabre wasn't some invincible super weapon that crushed inferior Soviet technology. The MiG-15 wasn't some crude Eastern Bloc death trap. They were both excellent aircraft, designed with different philosophies, and their success depended heavily on who was flying them and how they were used. The real lesson from the Korean War air battles isn't about which plane had better specs. It's about training, tactics, and doctrine. So that's it for this initial view on jet fighters used in the Korean War. If you have enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, and check out my other videos on military history. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.